Missouri. More than 2,800 people attended the assembly. Over half of those were delegates representing more than 500 congregations. Delegates are those attendees who are allowed to vote during the business sessions of the assembly. And they came from all 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Mexico. Imagine what it was like sitting in the convention hall with a couple of thousand UUs. I have to imagine because I wasn't able to go to Kansas City as I had hoped. Work required me to be in Seattle the next week, so I decided to pass on the trip to Kansas City. Instead, I was one of 200 delegates who attended General Assembly online, as I had done for 3 of the last 5 years. For those of you who aren't familiar with what goes on at the 4-day General Assembly, there are short worship services every morning with a full worship service on Sunday. There are several business sessions where we vote, hear reports, and honor people for their service. There are program sessions where attendees can choose from over a dozen workshops in each session on topics about social justice, religious education, worship, and other church-related activities. There are service projects to help the local community, and there are special evening events. In a few minutes, Jamie will describe what he and other UUI members who were able to go to Kansas City experienced being in the convention center with all those other UUs. I will describe what I witnessed through my computer monitor from the comfort of my home. Now, I want to assure you this isn't simply a what did I do during my summer vacation report. It is important that all of us be aware what is happening throughout our association. A couple of weeks ago, Jamie mentioned the sermon given on the last day of GA by the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, the president of the UUA. The sermon was entitled, "No Time for a Casual Faith." She stated, 2 things that are absolutely clear. Number 1, this is no time for a casual commitment to your faith, your community, and your values. And number 2, this is not time to think we are in this alone. General Assembly is an annual reminder that we are not in this alone, that we are part of a larger community of over 1,000 congregations that share our faith and our values. Each General Assembly has a theme, and this year's theme was, All Are Called. What I witnessed at this GA was expanding who is included when we say all, and a focus on what we are called to do at this moment in the history of our association, our country, and the world. 2 changes to the UU bylaws were made to make them more inclusive by better reflecting our current understanding of gender diversity. In the UUA's 7 principles and 6 sources, the second source was changed from words and deeds of prophetic women and men to words and deeds of prophetic people. A similar change was made to the bylaws to replace all gendered pronouns with the gender-inclusive pronouns they, them, or their. For example, the bylaw that states the president shall serve for a term of 6 years and until his or her successor is elected was changed to say until their successor was elected. Another bylaws change was to recognize the contribution of religious educators to our congregations by granting them delegate status at General Assembly. Previously, only master's level credentialed religious educators were automatically allowed to be delegates. The bylaws change now allows any active member of LREDA, the Liberal Religious Educators Association, who are serving congregations to become delegates automatically, just as ordained ministers are. The vote proceeded without opposition after statements of support both from LREDA and the Youth Caucus. Youth Caucus is a very powerful voice at General Assembly. And speaking of the youth, another change to the bylaws was to add 2 high school-aged youth trustees as voting members of the UUA Board of Trustees. For the past several years, there have been 2 non-voting youth observers on the board, so this change will now allow them to vote. Another bylaws change was approved to streamline the process used by the General Assembly for adopting social witness resolutions. There are 2 types of social witness resolutions which may come before the Assembly. One type is the Actions of Immediate Witness, or AIWs. As the name implies, These are resolutions that address current problems that require immediate action. Because these are timely issues, they can't afford a lengthy process of reflection, discussion, and action, things we're typically doing. Instead, AIWs are initiated by individual delegates and move through their entire creation and adoption process during a single General Assembly. They only carry the authority of the delegates at that General Assembly which they are passed, so it is just basically General Assembly asking congregations to get involved in these issues. The current process for approving the AIWs is rather convoluted and caused a little rebellion at this year's GA. 6 AIWs were voted on by the delegates on Saturday, and the top 3 were then added to Sunday's agenda. The 6 AIWs that were presented to the delegates were a moral response to the March for Our Lives, dismantle predatory medical care practices in prisons and end prisons for profit, end family separation and detention of asylum seekers and abolish ICE, end Israeli military detention of Palestinian children, join the Poor People's Campaign, and We Are All Related, Solidarity Now with Indigenous Water Protectors. Speaking of which. The 3 of the 6 that were chosen by the delegates were the ones about prisons, family separation, and indigenous water protectors. On Sunday, the delegates voted up or down on each of the AIWs separately. As often happens, all 3 passed. However, there was a lot of dissatisfaction that the Assembly couldn't show support for the other 3 AIWs that hadn't made the cut. So, co-moderator Alendria Williams offered a motion that the GA affirm the relevance and immediacy of the other 3 proposed actions of immediate witness, encouraging congregations and individuals to consider taking action on all of them. This motion was passed by the delegates. The second type of social witness resolution that can come before a General Assembly is called a Congregational Study Action Issue, or CSAI. These are more complex, longer-term issues than the actions of immediate witness. Selection of a CSAI by an assembly begins a multi-year process of study, reflection, and action, which often ends in the issue transforming into a UUA statement of conscience. This year, there were 2 very similar CSAIs to choose from, and the delegates overwhelmingly selected the one called Undoing Intersectional White Supremacy. Now, you have heard Jamie and myself and others talk a lot about white supremacy culture in recent months. What we mean by this is that our society views white culture as normative, as supreme, as the culture against which others are measured. And those of us who are fortunate enough to be born white have privileges that are not granted to people of color, such as not having the police called when we are sitting in a Starbucks or swimming in a pool. What we are being asked to do by this Congregational Study Action Issue, and by Black Lives of UU and by many others, is to dismantle white supremacy culture by decentering whiteness from its preeminent role in our society and in our religion. This call to denormalize white culture in Unitarian Universalism should come naturally to us. We already recognize the value of having no one theological stance be normative in our faith. Not Christianity, not atheism, nor any other. In the same vein, why should any specific culture be the norm in our faith? The trick is how to go about doing this work. Resources will be provided to help us work on the CSAI, and this will supplement other resources that are already available to us. But the work is not easy, and the CSAI reminds us that we can't just focus on the racial justice aspect. It says, white supremacy operates intersectionally, beyond black and white, and interwoven with other forms of oppression. It is multiracial and intersects with issues of class and income, gender, age, ethnicity, immigration status, sexual orientation, religion, ability, and more. This obviously is an issue that can't be solved overnight or even in a single year. It is work that will need to be ongoing for many years. But we can't be daunted by the challenge of this work. Each of us just needs to engage in it in whatever way works best for you. The one thing I know is we can't do this alone. We need to work together. We need to work with other UU congregations. We need to work with other faith communities. And, most importantly, we need to work with those most affected, the people in marginalized communities. UUI has already begun taking several steps in this area. We have participated in the Beloved Conversations curriculum. We have offered workshops on microaggressions. We have held discussions about adopting the eighth principle. Last week, the UUI Board of Trustees began a discussion of the characteristics of white supremacy culture and how those characteristics might manifest in our congregation. UUI has partnered with Faith in Indiana, which is about to launch a new campaign to get out the vote among marginalized communities for this year's important elections. Dismantling white supremacy culture is a big job, but it can be done if we have the will to make it happen. Many different opportunities to engage in this effort will be offered in the coming months. Please choose one. I will put links in the e-blast if you are interested in reading about the Congregational Study Action issue or the actions of immediate witness. Please contact myself or Jamie or our Social Justice Committee if you wish to engage deeper in any of these areas. So that is some of what I witnessed through my computer monitor. Being an online delegate, you don't get the full breadth of the GA experience. You only get to sample a few of the workshops, and you aren't surrounded by a couple of thousand UUs. But it is not a solitary experience either. There's a chat window provided where the other online delegates from across the country can talk with each other. We even created a Facebook group so we can keep in touch after GA ended. Still, I look forward to the next GA that I can attend in person. Now, Jamie will tell you what that is like.
Thank you, David. So this morning's service, by the way, answers the question, what's better than a sermon on Sunday morning? 2 sermons on Sunday morning. But first, I wanted to share just a few notes from a UUI member, Mark Walsh, who was also a delegate at General Assembly in Kansas City. He wasn't able to be here today. But he wanted you to know that he did attend a lot of workshops, a program on Christian hegemony, about how certain Christian language and concepts are used in our culture, a program about the UUI White Supremacy Teach-In, which UUI participated in back in last year. The program Joining the Movement for a Living Wage, about the importance of unions to our economic well-being, and a workshop on dealing with difficult behavior in the congregation, about the importance of safety issues and resources about that. So if you are interested in any of those subjects, feel free to talk to Mark Walsh when he gets back, and I'm sure he'll be happy to tell you about his experiences. So Unitarian Universalism is a religion that is famously hard to describe because it can't be summarized as a series of shared beliefs or as a creed. We say it's about seeking the truth together in love. We say it's about building a better world where the inherent worth and dignity of each person is respected. It's about recognizing the interdependence with one another and with the web of life, which calls us to care for one another and care for the earth. In many ways, at the heart of Unitarian Universalism is an attempt to imagine a different way for us all to be together. A way that is grounded in kindness and compassion, in respect for one another, and in freedom and responsibility. Our annual General Assembly is also many different things. It's a business meeting, it's a networking opportunity, it's worship, it's workshops. But for 4 days, it is also an attempt to imagine a different way of being together, one in which our UU values are taken seriously and lived out. Of course, there is no one idea about what that would look like. So GA is kind of like a lived workshop on how to do UU community. It's an annual conversation on how we want to be together and what our religion might look like in practice. General Assembly is therefore necessarily countercultural. Entering GA is like entering a different world for 4 days where common practices come in different UU flavors. The results can be surprising, amusing, endearing, sometimes a little challenging, but it is also always uplifting and inspiring. I'll give you some examples. There's a lot of planning that goes into General Assembly, and part of that planning is around environmental sustainability. So there's a lot of focus on recycling at this year's GA. So at every exit to every main hall, there was like this complicated array of trash receptacles that you were confronted with. It was like landfill, recycling, composting, there might have been a fourth one. And there were like signs above with pictures to show you what was supposed to go where. And I never ever felt like I was getting it right at any point in General Assembly. So one of the things that GA looks like is small groups of like puzzled people trying to understand their own trash. And at the cafeteria, especially, there were helper people. They wore these bright vests, and they had like these long handle with like a hand grippy thing on the end. And they were stationed by the trash, watching you, right? So I'd go up to the trash with my lunch tray, looking at the signs, trying to figure this out. And there's a young woman standing there, and with just like a completely neutral expression. After I did my thing, she would just take her tongs, correct everything that I did. And her face is just expressionless the entire time, but I'm sure she was thinking, like, there's a picture right there. Right there. And there were also teams of people sorting this trash throughout the entire assembly. We would get requests on our app, our little communication device, like, we need people to come help sort the trash. And it was this constant ongoing problem. But it had a big impact, because by the end of the convention, something like 10% of our trash went into landfills, and the other 90% was either recycled or composted. So it was a really big impact from all that work. And then what I thought was a really brilliant touch, our name badges that we wore for the entire conference were compostable. So my last act at General Assembly was to take my name badge off of its lanyard and put it in the compost bin, which I finally got one right there at the very end. One of the things General Assembly looks like is gender-inclusive restrooms. At every cluster of restrooms in the convention hall, there would be one gendered and one not. So at this hall, it might be like there'd be a woman's restroom and a gender-inclusive restroom. And at this hall, there'd be like a men's restroom and a gender-inclusive restroom. And when gender-inclusive restrooms were introduced to GA in 2015, they caused a lot of buzz because people weren't used to them and they didn't know quite what the experience of being in a restroom that just anyone was coming in and out of would be like. But by 2018, we all just kind of expected that would be there. Because as we know, for many transgender or non-binary or otherwise gender non-conforming people, just the question of which public bathroom to use in the day-to-day world can expose them to harassment or violence. So at General Assembly, there's an expectation that for everyone, something as simple and basic as using a restroom should be something that you can do with safety and dignity. It would be surprising if there weren't gender-inclusive restrooms at this point. Now, UUI has non-gendered restrooms in the cottage, but we haven't quite figured out yet to do with that in all of our other buildings. So this is a work in progress for us. General Assembly looks like 100 people lined up on a sidewalk singing hymns about love to the Westboro Baptist Church. They showed up to picket us with their usual, homophobic signs telling us that we were all sinners and that we were all going to hell. So we sang at them. And after an hour or so of us all singing love at them, they got very annoyed and they took their hateful signs and they went home. A General Assembly looks like making mistakes, learning from them, and trying to do better. At General Assembly, there is what's called a right relations team. And if you put 3,000 diverse strangers with very different ideas and habits and needs and cultural backgrounds in a building for 4 days for 12 to 16 hours, there are going to be some misunderstandings and there's going to be some conflict. So when that happens, you can go to the right relations team. And if you just want to vent, they will listen to you. But if you want to, if you need help having a conversation, they will help facilitate a conversation. And the first thing that happens every morning at the business meetings that we go to is the right relations team comes up and they give a report to the entire assembly about all of the feedback that they've been getting as like a reminder to all of us about how to get along better. So they might say, please assume that people that are going into the restroom that is correct for them. Or they might say, please let people in accessibility scooters with mobility issues exit the hall first. Or they might say, please remember that our youth also have a right to be in the halls, just like you. Or they might say, please stop referring to people of color by the name of whatever other random person of color you happen to know. Please, let's use our name tags. That's what they're there for. And in a stroke of genius, and I don't mean this to sound condescending, the public face of the right relations team is always like two of the most unbelievably charming young adult UUs you could possibly imagine, And they've got like these brilliant smiles and they're super friendly and they're just like, please stop doing this thing. And it doesn't feel like you're being scolded. It feels like aspirational, right? It feels like there's this extension of grace and this understanding that we're going to make errors because community is hard, but that we all really want to get better at this. Although I do remember from the year before, there was one day when the young person said to us, we're hearing that some people are setting their coffee cups on other people's mobility scooters. And he just did this. He said, we can do better, people. And of course, as you learned from David's talk, there is a lot of discussing and voting that happens at General Assembly. And sometimes the issues being voted on are about business, but most often they are about values. They are statements of how we want to be together, what we want to lift up collectively about who we are. And this can get tricky because we all have different ideas and different perspectives. And even seemingly simple things can turn out to be very complex. And navigating this is part of the work of building community together, but it's hard. It's hard work. And sometimes it is painful work. And there was an example of this at this year's General Assembly that I wanted to lift up because it really struck me how difficult and beautiful this thing is that we're trying to do together of building a space that holds all of our UU values. So the issue being voted on, which David referred to, was a language change to the sources section of our bylaws. If you get out your gray hymnal and you go to the first page after the title page, you'll see a listing of our 7 principles and our 6 sources. And in the sources section, one of them is the living tradition we share draws from many sources, including words and deeds of prophetic women and men, which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. Okay, so that is one of the deep sources that we say that we draw on, words and deeds of prophetic women and men. And the proposed language change was to change that to words and deeds of prophetic people. And the reason behind this change was to make our language inclusive to transgender, non-binary, or otherwise gender non-conforming people. Because we understand now as a society and as a religious community that the categories women and men do not capture everyone's lived reality, including the lived reality of many UU ministers and many of our beloved fellow Unitarian Universalists. And so the language change from women and men to people was intended to include people who were being excluded. And I thought at the time, this is going to be a really easy vote, right? There's not even going to be any discussion about this because of course we want to be inclusive. And who is going to argue against this? And I was wrong, as so often happens. There were several women who lined up at the con microphone, and they schooled us a little bit on our UU history. They reminded us that the 7 principles that we all cherish actually began as a movement led by UU women in the late 70s and the early 80s, who had noticed that the existing set of principles were full of sexist language. It was men this, man, mankind, brother, brotherhood. And they were tired of it. And so they started this movement to remove that sexist language from our existing bylaws. And that started this very long and big conversation that turned into a complete re-examination of how we want to talk about who we are. And after years of work, it resulted in our 7 principles. But it started as a conversation about sexist language. And the women at that time worked very, very hard to make that change, because you can imagine how they were dismissed, right? Everyone knows man means everybody, blah, blah, blah. They had to fight for it. And one of the things that they specifically fought for was introducing the woman-first language in that section, prophetic women and men. Didn't happen by accident. They had to really push for that, because it was a challenge to the patriarchal culture that existed in Unitarian Universalism and exists in our society, including Unitarian Universalism. So one of the women was speaking at the microphone, and she said to us, take out your GA program and open it up. So we did, and she said, turn to the part of the program where they're talking about this bylaw thing we're going to vote on. So we did, and she said, read it. What does it say? It says, we're going to vote to change prophetic men and women to prophetic people. In the program, the UUA people who wrote it didn't say prophetic women and men. They said prophetic men and women. They reflexively switched it back to the man-first language. She's like, how many people looked at this? How many proofreaders went right by this and just reverted it back to that male-first language? She said, this is an issue. It's still an issue. We fought so hard for this, and that change hasn't happened. And she said, and now all of that work that we did, all of that history is going to be erased, because women and men is going to be removed and it's going to be changed to people. And her hurt and her anger was really palpable in that room, right? She was near tears, and we could feel that. And I, who couldn't imagine how someone could possibly have been opposed to this change that I wanted, the change that seemed so obviously right to me, right? Who could object to this? I could then understand why someone might be opposed. And in the end, the assembly voted overwhelmingly to make the change from women and men to people, because we wanted to be inclusive. But also afterwards, people were talking to each other about this and how impacted they had been by what that woman had said, and how much more resolve they had to remember and honor the women who had done that work and to continue to carry that feminist work forward. And what we learned collectively that day is that change is very hard. That every change, no matter how desirable or progressive or seemingly in line with our UU values it may be, might feel like a loss to another person who is also a member of our beloved community. We learned how important it is to honor the work of those who come before us, to remember it and to carry it forward. And we learned how progress and pain can sit side by side, and often progress and pain sit side by side. And therefore how necessary compassion and grace and forgiveness, how necessary these are to creating the religious community that we want to share with each other. Now, I don't know how these different things sound to you. Compostable bins, gender-inclusive restrooms, right relations reports, right voting on these language changes. Depending on where you are situated, these might sound like relatively small things, or they might sound like very big things. But if they sound like small things, remember that our life, our religious life, is mostly lived out as a series of values decisions about small things. And things that might seem small to you could be huge for someone else. In the case of gender-inclusive restrooms back in 2015, when they were first introduced, some people were really uncomfortable with them. Why are we doing this? What does this mean? They were uncomfortable. And it was decided for the sake of our values that we were going to be uncomfortable and let some of us be temporarily uncomfortable so that other people could have safety and dignity. And then, over time, people got comfortable. So General Assembly is an experience in learning that we can do new things. We can do uncomfortable things. We can do difficult things and have difficult conversations. But the end result of all of this is an atmosphere that is joyful because we recognize that we are doing these things because we are trying to imagine into being a world that is more loving and more kind and more caring and more aligned with our UU values. So General Assembly also looks like hundreds of UUs in a worship service doing an impromptu conga line around the room to the music of Love Train, because there is joy in what we're creating here. And if we can create it at General Assembly, we can create it in the world. So I invite you to think about how your life, how your community here at UUI, and how the larger community we are all a part of could be more loving and more kind and more caring in ways both large and small. What I've learned at GA is that change is possible, and with love at the center, we can do difficult things together. Amen, and may it be so.